from our last two speakers. Gentlemen. So we have heard a lot, which has been fantastic. And so we have two more presentations, both about the Spanish Caribbean. First, Jorge Felipe Gonzalez from Michigan State, who will be talking about the slave trade to Cuba, and then Bethany Wade from Pitt will be talking about death and death records. So we'll start out with.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Jorge Felipe. This is my last year as a PhD student. For me, it's really symbolic to be here because 5.5 years ago, I was invited for 1 week for this conference in 2013. 1 week and a half, and that week and a half turned into 5 years and a half. And so I'm going to be presenting this data set that I have created over the past 7 years. I started working on this when I was in Cuba, on the Cuban archive and libraries. And this is basically a data set on slave arrivals, slave ships' arrival at departures to Cuba. So the period that I'm covering is 79 and 1820s, which mostly just a basic context. This is the period when Cuba transitioned from being a society with a slave to a slave society. It's the boom of the sugar plantation economy. It's also the moment when Cubans set up the whole infrastructure to trade slaves in Africa for the first time. We should remember that before the Spanish slave trade relied on foreign merchants, on foreign flags, and Cubans at that point set the whole infrastructure to actually go to Africa, and they did it in the margin of 30 years. So because I wanted to understand how this happened, I started creating this data set that resulted in 2,200 slave ships arriving to Cuba. I work first with these newspapers. I carefully work with every day of the newspaper published between 1792 and 1822 in Havana. These newspapers have something that is really interesting for data sets on a slave trade, which is the entry and departure of slave or embarkations in general, among them slave ships. So I spent a few years actually putting together this. That's one of the, I guess, good side of not having internet in Cuba. So you don't have any way to find any type of entertainment. And precisely because I didn't have internet either, I didn't know about the Transatlantic slave trade database, which was online at that point. So basically I was doing this job like twice. That part of this was already done. But when I got to this conference in 2013, I started working with Professor Hawthorne and Professor Elkis, and this Transatlantic slave trade database added this data that I found over the years. So this is a sample of the newspapers. As you can see, this is an arrival, a newspaper. This is the one from 1816 that I showed before. This is a sample. You can see that in every newspaper, you can see date of arrival, provenance, length of the voyage, vessel's name, number of slaves on board, the master or consignee of the cargo, captain's name, and flag and rig. I created a spreadsheet with this, and that's what I had when I came to this conference in 2013. So I also work with the custom records from Santiago de Cuba, from Matanzas, from Trinidad, which are other ports in Cuba. Santiago de Cuba is actually the second largest port in the island in terms of importation of enslaved Africans. And you can see in this sample what type of information you can find in these sources. So what was the result of this? I also worked with the court cases concerning slave ship, British parliamentary papers, Spanish archival records. And the second step, once I was here, I compared my data set with every entry, each ship by ship, vessel by vessel, in the Transatlantic slave trade database. I realized that, first of all, there were voyages missing. Many of them from Santiago de Cuba. Santiago de Cuba was actually missing altogether. There were like 3 voyages from Santiago de Cuba. Now there are 300 of them, if I'm not mistaken. There was also some supplementary data that was missing, like date of departure from Cuba, or the consignee of the slave ships, or the actual exact date of arrival, and so on. So basically I was comparing all this, and after doing this process, I add this data to the Transatlantic slave trade database. So all this work is right now available online. But there was also a side of that that didn't find a place in the Transatlantic slave trade database, but because they were intra-American voyages. So this newspaper not only had the transatlantic voyages, they also have the intra-American voyages. And coincidentally, Professor Greg O'Malley and Alex Moruki, they start working, developing this intra-American slave trade database, and mostly they start adding this information, working with them for the past 2.5 years, adding this new data to the intra-American slave trade database. The result is that now there are 500 new transatlantic and intra-American voyages. We have data on Cuban ports beside Havana, such as Santiago de Cuba. All the supplementary data that I mentioned already, clearly that came with new sources, and some data was corrected. But in general terms, what is more striking about this is that the result was a substantial increase of what we knew about how many slaves actually arrived to Cuba between 1790 and 1820. And what you have in this table is in these previous figures, all the golden standards of the Cuban slave trade, Humboldt, Sacco, Pérez de la Riva, Herbert Klein, and Gloria Garcia. And this is the new numbers for the importation of a slave to Cuba. And if these numbers by themselves are not striking enough, we should remember that the United States, in its whole history, imported around 400,000 slaves. And Cuba, in 30 years, imported 311,715 enslaved Africans. Now, this data set also allowed for something else, which is understanding the nationality of the slave ships that were bringing slaves to Cuba. And as you can see, you have the Spain, United States, England, Denmark, etc. And this is important for something that I'm going to mention later, but just in advance, because understanding who were these ships or what was the nationality of the ship is a key or a shortcut to understand actually where these slaves were coming from. Because as we know, national flags or national carriers operated in some Africans and not in others. So if you have, for example, more slaves arriving from the United States in the 1790s to Cuba, we know that those ships, for example, were fitted in Rhode Island. We can certainly guess that most of these ships actually came from the Gold Coast, where Rhode Islanders had many of these slave trading operations. So another thing that this allowed is to find a distribution between intra-American and transatlantic voyages to Cuba. In this case, you can see in the straight line the transatlantic voyages, and then you have the intra-American, which clearly after 1811 decayed. Now, that peak there is 1817, which was the year that Spain signed the treaty with England, abolishing the slave trade in the next 3 years. So that year, Cuba received around 35,000 slaves. So to put this number in perspective, the colossus nation of Brazil that year received around 44,000 slaves. Cuba, which is clearly compared to Brazil extremely tiny, received almost the same amount, 10,000 less than Brazil. And those numbers are demographically important for just 1 year. And most of them actually are arriving to Havana, not even to the whole island. So also this data allowed to find the intra-American embarkation ports, which are here detailed in different sections like United States, British West Indies, Danish West Indies, Dutch West Indies, etc. And those are the intra-American embarkation regions of the slaves that came to Cuba through this path. Now, something else is that you can determine changes over time. That this fluctuation in slave importation to Cuba are actually determined by international changes and events. For example, you have a peak in 1792 that is directly connected to the revolution in Saint-Domingue, because the French slave traders redirect their operations from what would become Haiti to Cuba after the revolution. And that's something that is really important to understand the French presence in Cuba, for example, at that point, and how Cubans learned how to trade slaves, for example, in French-controlled areas in Africa. We have also the moments where Spain was in war against England, and you have how the slave trade importation declined and how they went up again after the end war and so on. I think the table more or less is clear. I have only 2 minutes. This also, you can see changes over time in relation to flags. You can see how the blue became prevalent after 1808, which is the abolition of the slave trade, when the Spanish slave traders actually became the owners. Not initially. Initially, they were in partnership with Americans, and most of them were covering American operations. But lately, over time, after 1815 mostly, Cubans actually owned these slaving expeditions. That was not the case before. So finally, the transatlantic. The problem with the transatlantic is that the sources don't mention the origin of the slave. You have, we can see here the African unknown. The first line is those slaves that we don't know. Ships, what we don't know where they come from. And this is a problem that is in the transatlantic slave trade database as well. And I want to finish saying that a shortcut for this problem could be using, for example, the baptismal records, which how can we combine a transatlantic slave trade database, which is a database on ships, on big numbers, with individuals, which is in this case the archival records from baptismal records that are available in Professor Jane Landers' website, Ecclesiastical Sources for the Slave Society, although the name is different now, right? Yes, the name is different now. Okay. So, and then that allows, using these baptismal records from Africans recently arrived to Cuba, that allows to guess where this slave come from. Because Cubans put these names to Africans arrived to Cuba, like Guinea, Ganga, Mandinga, Mina. That doesn't mean anything ethnic, but certainly we can locate this geographically. And by doing so, if we follow this over time and we have a huge database for the same period, and we combine this database from baptismal record of enslaved Africans to the transatlantic slave trade database, that's a shortcut to actually figure out where this slave come from, because the data set or the database on a slave ship by themselves don't allow to do this at this point. Thank you so much.
So questions for Jorge? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, 5 years go by fast, right?
They do. They go really fast.
We were sitting in the room with you and Gwen. Okay.
Yes.
My question is, did you identify, does your data allow you to identify inter-American exchange, Cuba inter-American exchange, shipping of slaves to Colombia specifically, and even more specifically to Barranquilla?
I haven't found a single entry of a slave arriving, you mean from Cuba to Barranquilla? No, I haven't. I haven't found a single slave going to Colombia. Mostly the data set that I have is arrivals to Cuba, more than the partials from Cuba to Colombia.
It came to me because you said you were tracing inter-American stuff.
Yes.
And secondly, here's the tantalizer for you to see if you can find it. I have soft data identifying that a royal woman in Barranquilla in Cuba was a practitioner of one of Cuba's organic religions, asked that Cuba send the highest female person to train her people, her slaves.
Interesting. What year?
It was before the Inquisition in Colombia, because the
Oh, yeah, this is 18th, 19th century, but that's
Yes.
it. Thank you for the date.
You may be, and the soft information doesn't just give me that one example, but says that there was indeed a transportation communications pathway based on religious practices between Cuba and Colombia.
Thank you.
So, given what you're finding here and the higher estimates of people being brought in from Africa, could you estimate about in 1790 and then in 1820 about how many black people in Cuba were born in Africa in 1790 and then again in 1820? Take a shot at that?
Yeah, that's something that is really missing in Cuba. A serious demographic study on national reproduction of Africans. But something is clear is that there was a census in 1817. The numbers that they mention of enslaved Africans in Cuba don't match at all with the huge number that arrived in this period. The only guess is that they were dying in these sugar plantations like flies, and they were basically that myth. One of the myths of the Cuban slavery is that it was somehow better or more milder than other slavery, and in fact, in the sugar plantations, people were dying. The life expectancy was even some 7 years. So that doesn't match with the importation number with the reproduction rate. They don't go together, and it's staggering.
One last question? One last short question, Bruno.
So looking through your data on ethnicity and so on, how far this data allows you to go in the interior of West Africa?
Almost, it doesn't allow at all. Because the data that we actually have right now, which is the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, is mostly about regions or specific ports, at best. At worst, they only say African coast. And if you combine this with the baptismal record, what they mention is stuff like, let's say, Ganga, which you can guess is from the Sierra Leone area, but you cannot actually point out exactly from where. So this data doesn't allow, like you can do, for example, with the liberated Africans. You can do that most accurate than with this data. This data doesn't help for that at all.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bethany.
Hello.
Hi.
Right, yes. Go to me. You got that? And they want us to get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want to wander away from that.
Yeah, bang. All right. Okay. I know I'm the last panel of the day, so I'm going to just jump right into this. My database, which is very much a work in progress, explores the relationship of race, class, and legal status to burial hierarchies in the 19th century Spanish Caribbean. And while it includes data from both Cuba and Puerto Rico, for the purposes of clarity and brevity, I'm going to focus primarily on the Cuban section. I will briefly discuss the sources, the processes of data collection and standardization, and I'm going to end with some of the types of digital spatial analysis that I'm performing. To offer some context, my research deals with burial reform in the late 18th and early 19th century, more specifically the abandonment of churchyard burial and the adoption of general cemeteries. I asked questions about how burial space was used, who had access, who was excluded or marginalized, and how did individuals negotiate this system. As Pamela Vocal describes, the floors and chapels of the churches in Latin America were a fetid reflection of distinctions among the living. And yet, our understanding of the system often comes through the practices of elites, whose experiences left such a heavy imprint in the archives, both textual and material. In seeking to reconstruct a more comprehensive picture of how burial space was used, I incorporated parish burial records into my study, and these records became the data source for this project. If I'm being honest, I didn't start out to build a database. That move was driven by the form and accessibility of the parish records. I started with data collection and then proceeded to database design. And as any digital or data specialist will tell you, this is a terrible approach to database design. But in spite of all of the headaches and sort of after work that this has caused me, these records have already offered an informative and challenging glimpse into social hierarchies in the late colonial Spanish Caribbean. So I want to talk a little bit about parish burial records. In Havana, these records have never been consolidated or centralized. They remain in the church offices across the city. These are working offices with very irregular and limited hours. And photographing and digitally reproducing the records, I did not get permission to do that. I could access them, but I couldn't digitally reproduce them. This is one of the better maintained offices, but the reality is that these books are stored in non-climate controlled environments in Cuba's hot and humid climate. The physical condition of these records is poor and deteriorating, and I just want to give a shout out to any of the digitizing projects that are trying to conserve these, such as the Slave Society's Digital Archive or Family Search, which has actually digitized the Puerto Rican records that I work with. This is so important because these are literally falling apart. In one archive, I was actually handed a plastic bag of sort of disintegrating pages. That was the only sort of traces left of a book that covered 15 years of burials. So it's imperative that these types of projects continue. However, even when in good condition, these are handwritten, descriptive, textual records. So I should note here that in Havana, the parish has kept 2 sets of books, one for people of color and one for the white population. And individual records within these books are not standardized or uniform. The language, form, and content varies greatly, both over time, across parishes, and even between the different sets of books within one parish. So obviously this offers quite a bit of difficulty from the process of gathering data and building a database. My approach to this was sampling. In many ways, this project was a methodological proof of concept in my dissertation, so I decided to sample records from periods pivotal to my own work. The first section was 1805, 1806, which was when the first general cemetery in Havana was constructed, and the second period was 1868 to 1873, which corresponds with the opening of the second general cemetery. The process of data collection, which preceded database design, was extremely messy. Again, these are short records often, but they're very dense. There's quite a lot of information in there that you sort of have to expand out, put into tables, and then clean. So the types of information are biographical, name, gender, birth status, marital status, age, so-called racial information, and this is a very messy sort of array of items, but including legal status, color, as well as place of birth. Death and burial information, so the sacraments received, the funeral, the will, and the location of the interment, as well as a lot of geographical information, although this isn't necessarily recognizable as such until you sort of do a process of transformation on it. The data collection, I was really focused on efficiency, so getting as much from the records as I could. So what I did was basically build Excel tables and sort of transcribe key sections of this material. If you note on the bottom, this is one parish, so because they're sort of non-standard over time or across sort of even the records, each parish had a year and sort of a classification, and then I had to consolidate over 80 tables into one database. So that process of consolidation was also sort of the beginning of the standardization of this data. And I would say that the cleaning, standardizing, and geocoding, which is really making this database functional, is where I'm at now. It's a very slow process because a lot of the sort of data capture that I did is still in textual format, so I have to then sort of break down how that actually fits into different types of data. So that's an overview of what my database looks like. What I want to do and spend the rest of the time doing is sort of looking at some of the types of analysis that I've been doing with this. So I'm using a sample of data from the final 6 months of churchyard burials in Havana. This represents about 500 burials. So this is sort of a standard kind of representation that you might pull out of data. We can see here, this would be a very typical breakdown of burial locations in a Spanish Catholic city. Here we have a small number that are in religious orders. This is the most exclusive site. We have the majority are ending up buried in the parish holdings. This represents a small burial ground attached to a charitable hospital. We have a small number that had no data included, and the rest are illegible. However, within these sites, we have an interior breakdown. In the religious orders, we actually have unspecified locations, just indicating the person was buried in the convent or monastery. We have tertiary orders, and then we have the main church. In the parish, we have unspecified interior locations, so these are inside the church, but it doesn't say specifically where. These are named chapels or altars, and then we have cemetery burials, which are actually outside of the church proper. So this is a basic breakdown of the sites. With this, though, when we start layering on these different classifications that were used, this is if it's broken down just by the books, we start to see that real division and hierarchy of space. So the white population was primarily using the religious orders. We have a few exceptions in people of color, but again, the cemetery space was largely being used by people of color. If we layer then on freedom or their legal status, we can see that it was almost entirely enslaved people who were being buried in these cemeteries. So this is one way to kind of think about locations using the place names that are actually in the records. However, when we geocode it, we can actually look at this from a different perspective. We can look at it from a mapping perspective. So I don't trust things to run properly in presentations. So I actually recorded a demo, and I'm going to sort of live narrate this recording, which hopefully I don't lose my track. Okay, so this is actually the power view function that's part of Excel. So this is in Excel drawing directly from the data that I have. Because I've geocoded these locations of burial, what I can do is then sort of create a visualization of these spaces that I've been talking about. So this visualization doesn't tell us too much of that fine-grained detail. This is just indicating all of the locations that were actively used in the 6 months prior to the opening of general cemeteries. The larger dots are the parishes, which were our principal sites. The remainder are those religious orders, with that one little one at the bottom being the burial ground of the charitable order. So then we can start to layer directly information from the database. So this is a very geographic process. This is the color breakdown is actually the different parishes. And if you hover over it, you can actually see a pop-up of the breakdown. So we can see what parishes were actually sending people to what religious orders in this 6-month period. Again, though, this doesn't get us at that heart of the necessarily hierarchy of space. If we divide it just along the categories of sort of the Españoles versus Pardos and Morenos, we see that the white population had the most movement within the system. They were the population that was, again, most accessing those religious orders. Another way to look at this is to move away from the parish breakdown and just look at the city broken down by those very broad racial categories. Again, we see in the parishes a heavy prevalence of the population of color. And when we look at these smaller sites, those more exclusive religious orders, again, they're trending towards the white population, using them predominantly. Waiting for this to catch up with me. So when we add in legal status, we see again visually that the enslaved population had no mobility in the system. They are in the parishes or in the site associated with the charitable hospital. We see the free people of color have some limited mobility, and again, the white population is the ones who have the most choice within the system or the most movement. And the final sort of layering that I did here is to again change the color breakdown to those sort of interior location sites. So again, with the orangey yellow being the cemetery burial, which was sort of exterior, again, we see how there's a difference even across racial lines, with the enslaved population being principally in the cemeteries, and then the free population having some limited mobility. So that is sort of my database and some of the analytical work that I've been doing that really taps into the power of data-driven spatial analysis to sort of ask questions about society and how it was functioning in Cuba in the late colonial period. So thank you very much. Thank you.
We have some questions for Bethany.
Yes. Hi.
First of all, you can do some really cool things with Excel.
Yeah. You have to break Excel to your will, eventually, yeah.
And then I have a question for you, and it's not, I don't want to sound like I'm attacking you at all, so
No.
just need to preface this first. But when you're working with like the documents, before you work with them, like did you like ever consult like a paper conservator about like how to work with these really fragile documents, and like and did they, if you did, like did they ever offer advice, and then then offer advice to the people that have these, like really, you know,
Yeah.
kind of questions and like a better way to score them or something like that?
Yeah, so in terms of training, I frequently work with very poor conditions. So just in various archives, I've worked with conservators and people who, oh, how do you, like, which books do you just not touch? How do you turn pages? Like, how do you,
Yeah.
whether wearing some kind of hand covering is actually good for the documents or not. In terms of offering advice, it's a very precarious space to be in. I would never want to sort of, it's a very relational, like I'm working in the offices with office managers day in, while the parishes are functioning around me. I never want to be that person who's coming in and telling them how to manage stuff or what to do. At the same time, it's devastating when you see some of these conditions. So no, I don't see that as my relationship with the people I'm working with, because often it is literally the office manager. It isn't even somebody who would necessarily have this sort of control over that. However, when I work in the like the ecclesiastical archive, I do speak with the archivist there about, is there a potential for these sources to be moved from the is there a way to put them in a centralized location where possibly there could be climate control or some type of management, but more in a conversational, I'd love to know how your system is, versus I think you should do this, because I don't see that I have that voice to go into their space and sort of dictate. Having said that, it's completely devastating when you see stuff that you're like, this might not be here in 5 years. So, yeah.
What, could you explain to us a little bit about what some of the opposition to photographing the documents are? What have you encountered? What kind of reasons? What animates that opposition?
Part of it, I think, is that Cuba is so relational, and I'm a new person working with the church archives. I think that part of it is they don't know me. I'm somebody who they don't know what I'm going to do with this material. They don't. So you can access it, and you get that permission actually through the diocese, and then you still have another layer. Then I go to the parishes and meet with the parish priests, who are sometimes like, who's saying you can come in and look at my records? And there's sometimes that political situation. And then my actual day-to-day work is with, like I said, office managers. So part of it is, in Cuba, the rules change all the time. And right now we're in sort of a space of tightening of access. So part of it is this idea of their cultural heritage, this is their past. But people have successfully been given that permission. It seems to be a longer term relationship, though, that leads to that. So I think over years, as I go back, as I build more sort of longer term connections and almost demonstrate that I am going to use this data responsibly, I'm not going to, sort of put anyone in any questionable situations, that I anticipate will open up. But as this was my first time sort of working with the church archives, I also didn't want to come in as, this thundering, no, let me do what I want. I'd be like, absolutely, if that's the rules, I will follow them, because hopefully I'll be coming back for years. And as I build that sort of relationship with the people whose history this is, hopefully there'll be an opening up. Again, I was talking with Jane and I was like, this needs to expand into the 19th century to get these digitized, but also to get them public facing. Mm-hmm. I think that's another huge challenge for working with these archives.
We're going to give the last question to Gwen.
Okay, all right. Well, first it's a remark and then it's a question.
Perfect.
I do not agree that you come to a database with preconceived questions, because that you have to respect the documents. Mm-hmm. The better you know the documents, the more you learn about the documents, the better questions you can ask. And I think that asking the right question is more important than getting the right answers.
Yes.
Okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, next point. Do you get any notion at all about mortality among slaves? This was something that Jorge was bringing up, that there were so many slaves imported into Cuba. and the population of the slaves does not reflect the huge importation. Do you have any idea of the age levels at death, the numbers, how many slaves were actually buried in the church at all?
Yes.
Did it cost to bury in the church? Did some masters bury them on the side of the road to avoid paying these?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions that I wrestle with, because legally you had to be buried in the church, but in practice we know that there were people who were like, oh, I'm just gonna shove them in the, disappear them. It's not broken down, but you can see, I can look at the number of slave deaths, and then I can push further on that because I do have these other levels of data. So I can say how many of these are newly arrived. In this early set of records, they actually, in Cuba, didn't record age. It was less common. Later on they did, and in my Puerto Rican sources they did the entire time. But in this period, 1805, 1806, not just for people of color, for the entire population. It just wasn't a data point they were tracking. So in this earlier moment I can't look at age, but later I can. So where you start to see questions about are people being buried outside of the churches, for me, one indicator that this is possibly happening, yes, there were costs associated with burial. This hierarchy was also monetized. So, and there was a requirement for the parishes to offer charitable burial to certain legal classes of poor people. And there are very few enslaved people who are getting these charitable burials, which indicates to me that the owners either had the responsibility to pay for it, and potentially when they didn't have the money, instead of sort of going through this process, there was some alternate practice. But the enslaved population actually had very low numbers of charitable burials. But there were still quite a large number of the enslaved population entering the churches, again, sort of segregated into the lowest tier, the lowest cost section in the cemetery.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dean, who just magically appears to give final closing remarks. First of all, let's thank Dean and the team here.